what emphasis Okay, I think they checked at 9:03, and then we like checked out the
Good afternoon, everyone. Shall we make a start? I'm absolutely delighted to see so many of you here. With a bit of luck, we'll find a seat for all of you. Welcome to the first All Souls Criminology Seminar of the year. Over the years, these events have taken on a similar kind of ritual form, the first of which some of you will have participated in, because we get tea and biscuits to get you here earlier. After the talk is finished, we generally alternate between staying here and just continuing the conversation, and some wine will appear, and some weeks we just go off to the turf. So this is a week where we'll stay here. So when we're done, anyone who wants to stay and hang around and continue to chat is very welcome to do so. Before we do any of that, I should welcome our speaker, who is Dr. Tilman Schwarze from the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow. He's been there for 3 years. He previously did his PhD in International Relations at the University of St Andrews, and has a whole series of interests at the intersection of criminology, spatial theory, urban studies, which we're going to hear about today. Some of these have taken shape in his book, which is on the screen behind him, and he's going to both talk about that book as well as some of the ways in which Henri Lefebvre's work can be of interest to us in that bit of the social sciences we call criminology. So without further ado, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to start a timer as well to make sure I stay in time. Well, thank you very much. I would first of all say thank you to you, Ian, for this very kind invitation to give today's seminar, but also extend this to the All Souls College for hosting me as part of the seminar series. It is really beautiful college, it's a privilege to be here, so thank you very much. So as you can see on the screen here, my talk is titled Space, Crime in the City, Henri Lefebvre and Criminological Research. And there are two things that I would like to do in today's talk. The first one is, as Ian already mentioned, I would like to talk about part of my research that informed my recently published book, that you can see here, which was published last year in December with Palgrave. If you're interested, the ebook can be accessed through the QR code. And as the title suggests, this book identifies ways in which the work of French philosopher and sociologist Henri Lefebvre can inform empirical research on urbanization, the production of space, politics, and everyday life in the city. And based on this introduction, the second part of my talk is dedicated to outlining ways in which Henri Lefebvre's work can be useful for criminological research in particular. And here I want to particularly focus on his theory of the production of space and its relevance to criminological research, but I also want to stress that these are just ideas, so there's not a fully developed research agenda, so I would love to hear your thoughts and have a conversation about that. But let me start with my book. So what is it about? This book is about the production of space, politics and everyday life on the south side of Chicago. And its central goal is to bring the work of Henri Lefebvre into sustained and productive dialogue with geographical and sociological research on the US city. However, this book is more than just a summary of the key theoretical contributions of Henri Lefebvre's work for our understanding of space, the urban, everyday life, and other related concepts so crucial for geographical and sociological inquiry. Rather, the book is about identifying ways in which Lefebvre's work can be used for empirical, interdisciplinary, sociological, and geographical research on the city. And there are two key assumptions which guide my book. The first one is that while much has been said about Henri Lefebvre's work and how it has been critical in the development of key theoretical concepts and debates within geographical and sociological scholarship, applications of his oeuvre for empirical research remain underdeveloped. And I argue in my book that this is a missed opportunity because Lefebvre's theories and concepts, in my opinion, lend themselves to empirical research in the US city, but potentially also beyond that, which I show through an ethnographic study on everyday life in the South Shore neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, which is a predominantly African-American neighborhood that has been historically deprived and racially segregated, and whose stigma as the quote-unquote poor, crime-inflicted, and violent community persists in public discourses today, but I will talk about that in more detail in a second. And the second assumption that follows is that any attempt to meaningfully engage Lefebvre's work for empirical research in the contemporary US city, but again, I would say this applies to the UK as well, needs to connect his work to questions on the racialization of space, and I will talk about this throughout this talk as well. And in contrast to most existing empirical studies on Lefebvre, my book does not just draw selectively on a key number of his concepts, such as the well-known and often cited the right to the city. Instead, and here perhaps lies the novelty of the book, it develops a coherent and comprehensive application of Lefebvre's work for empirical research, which builds on a detailed reading of his entire body of writing. From his earliest writings on the rural, everyday life, modernity, the urban language, ideology, violence, the state, and of course, crucially, his magnus opum, the production of space. So what I would like to do in the following first part of this talk is to outline 3 areas of my empirical examination of urbanization and everyday life in Chicago through Henri Lefebvre's collective work. And this then will be followed by a discussion of how his work can be relevant to criminological research. So what are these 3 areas of empirical research? The first one is the political economy and symbolic violence of territorial stigmatization and the criminalization of urban space, which I have analyzed through Lefebvre's writing on language, ideology, lived space, and the relationship between space and the human body. The second one is the structural violence of state-led urban planning and associated gentrification-led redevelopment through a discussion of Chicago's public housing transformation by drawing on Lefebvre's work on urban planning, urbanism, the concept of abstract space, and the right to the city. And finally, I use Lefebvre to theorize the structural violence of gentrification-led urban infrastructure redevelopment, which I will exemplify through a discussion of a recent example of infrastructure development, the Obama Presidential Center on Chicago's South Side. But let me start with my analysis of territorial stigmatization on Chicago's South Side, which, as you will see over the course of this talk, comprises an overarching framework for making sense of all kinds of urbanization in Chicago. And in my analysis of stigma, I foreground how mainstream media framings fixate on the idea that the neighborhood South Shore is a violent no-go community where gang violence and shootings are quotidian aspects of daily life. So sensationalism and hyperbolic framings of street violence continue to reproduce racist representations of the black community as a key driver of urban violence and crime. And through a 5-year discourse and critical discourse analysis of newspaper coverage of the neighborhood, I show how the community is spatially homogenized as one large area of crime, violence, and insecurity. And here I show that the language of violence and crime is infused with specific ideologies about black communities as drivers of urban insecurity in the United States, and therefore language becomes political. And Lefebvre's work on ideology, representation, and language provided a useful theoretical scaffolding for dissecting these stigmatizing media. For example, in his book, The Explosion, Marxism and the French Revolution, he states that, and I quote, "To reduce means not only to simplify, schematize, dogmatize, and classify, it means also to arrest and to fix." End of quote. And in his book, The Sociology of Marx, Lefebvre argues that ideologies, and I quote, "refract rather than reflect reality via pre-existing representations selected by the dominant groups and acceptable to them." End of quote. So for Lefebvre, ideologies tend to claim for themselves to be self-sufficient, being the result of specific historical developments and which operate by extrapolating the reality they interpret and transpose. And as such, ideologies seek to achieve universality, even though they are only representative of determinate limited special interests. And here, ideologies serve as instruments in reproducing and upholding class, racial, and gender disparities and differentiations. So the main point about ideologies for Lefebvre is that, and I quote, "the most completely elaborated ideological representations find their way into language, become a permanent part of it." And so in my analysis of media language and framings, I show how words like crime-infested, gang-ridden, gang-infested, just words that are identified in my media framings and discourse, reduce South Shore to a space of physical violence. The ideology intrinsic to these representations of space, following Stuart Hall, is determined by racist classifications. Media representation and language choices reproduce racist ideologies and discourses about South Shore as a black community by reducing it to a homogeneous space of violence and insecurity. But there is, of course, also a much more sociological dimension to territorial stigmatization and the criminalization of space, which are much more immediately felt in residents' everyday lives. In a conversation that I've had, residents told me that such negative and stigmatizing words and discourses are emotionally hurtful because they misrepresent everyday life in the community, ignoring residents' strong sense of place and belongingness with their community. And particularly for long-term residents who have lived in South Shore for decades, sometimes their entire lives, stigmatizing news representations leave them alienated from the ways in which the outside perceives their community. And so in my study of the impact of the stigma on residents' lived everyday experiences, Lefebvre's conceptualization of alienation provided important theoretical ideas. So alienation for him is a key term to understand everyday life. As he states himself in the foreword to the second edition of the first volume of the Critique of Everyday Life, and I quote, "The fact remains that the critique of everyday life was built entirely around a concept which Lenin had left aside or neglected, the concept of alienation," end of quote. And so the reference to Lenin already shows that Lefebvre, of course, arrived at this discussion of alienation of everyday life by extending Marx's argument about the alienation of workers under capitalism. But Lefebvre views Lefebvre not purely as an economic phenomenon, but one that pertains to every aspect of society. For him, capitalism dominates social and cultural life as much as economic production, with the result that alienation can be found in all strata of human existence. As he states in Everyday Life in the Modern World, and I quote, "New types of alienation have joined ranks with the old, enriching the typology of alienation, political, ideological, technological, bureaucratic, urban, etc. We would suggest that alienation is spreading and becoming so powerful that it obliterates all trace or consciousness of alienation," end of quote. So in simple terms, alienation has become a totalizing social practice for Lefebvre. And as stated by the philosopher Paul Osborne, and I quote again, Lefebvre thought to redefine Marxism on the basis of the early Marxist concept of alienation as critical knowledge of everyday life. So the focus is on everyday life and the knowledge of that when we talk about alienation. And so for understanding residents' lived everyday experiences with territorial stigmatization and the criminalization of their community, the notion of alienation allowed me to decipher the role of emotional responses to stigma. Residents noted and were deeply affected by racist and violent media portrayals of their community. They felt that the ubiquity and dominance of media discourse of South Shore as a violent community implicate them directly, exposing them to perpetual misrepresentation, stigmatization, and also harm. So community members frequently told me that foregrounding of violence in media discourses negatively impacts their sense of self as a community, as well as their psychological well-being. And one emotional response that I observed was the development of mistrust towards other members of the community. So the constant exposure to media coverage of yet another shooting, including newspapers' tendency to provide very little details and information about the circumstances of violence, to quote one resident, created a situation where the media was changing our image of ourselves. So we looked at each other thinking, I wonder if she's the one that hurt somebody last night. End of quote. So territorial stigmatization also alienates residents from each other. And residents' self-image of the community changed because of stigmatizing media rhetoric, where the generation of mutual distrust is just one instance of human alienation via the division within the self of the community. And here, alienation, following Lefebvre, and I quote, is the result of a relation with otherness. And this relation makes us other, in other words, it changes us, tears us from ourselves, and transforms an activity, be it conscious or not, into something else. But really important to stress, alienation here should not be mistaken to mean acceptance or tolerance on the side of the community. Rather, for many residents I spoke to, although the painful emotions triggered by media coverage were narrated to be long-lasting and deeply felt, they were not the only emotions that residents identified. They also spoke frequently about emotions of resolve, resistance, and acknowledgement that if media rhetoric was unlikely to change, it was up to them to change the public image of their community. And what they meant by resolve here was that they felt a responsibility as members of this community to view their community not through the predetermined lens of the large Chicago papers, but through alternative discourses. So, in other words, they translated their feelings of alienation into practices of everyday resistance. And this resistance to stigma took place in different forms. So, for example, counter discourses and alternative knowledge of community spaces are crucial for residents to foreground other aspects of everyday life outside of feelings of violence. And in conversations, residents stated to me that for them, telling each other that the community is so much more than the experience of violence is the way for them to challenge the hegemony of crime discourses in media framings in order to foreground alternative knowledge structures and representations of space. Embodied spatial practices following Lefebvre's work on space and the human body, such as walk in the community collectively, allow residents to show that it is in fact safe to be in public spaces. And reinforcing collective feeling of place attachment and belongingness with their community has been critical in challenging the hegemony of symbolic violence of territorial stigma, foregrounding that the lived space in South Shore is so much more than the occurrence of physical violence. But also important to stress here is that the ways in which the media, newspapers in particular, pre-selects and predefines the boundaries of their social spatial conceptualizations of urban space are not autonomous or independent from the broader working of capitalist urban redevelopment. And Imogen Taylor makes an important point in this respect, stating that the stigmatization of urban communities is, and I quote, enmeshed with wider capitalist structures of expropriation, domination, discipline, and social control, where stigma functions to devalue entire groups of people with the purpose of both fortifying existing social hierarchies and creating new opportunities for the redistribution of wealth upwards. End of quote. So there's therefore also a distinct political economy of territorial stigmatization and the criminalization of space that I want to now discuss with regards to public housing transformation, but also with regards to infrastructure urban redevelopment. For today, I don't want to go into a detailed discussion of how public housing transformation took place in Chicago from 1999 onwards, when the city decided to tear down its public housing high-rises. But let me just say here that this urban planning intervention was probably one of the worst social experiments of the city since Chicago's urban renewal of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, when the city literally bulldozed entire African-American neighborhoods under the premise of quote-unquote slum clearance and rehabilitation. But public housing transformation from the early 2000s onward permanently unhomed tens of thousands of black residents, displacing them from the homes which were demolished to redevelop the land on which they were built for more affluent residential accommodation close to Chicago's central business district. While South Shore, the neighborhood where I did my research in itself, was never home to public housing projects, it became a destination community for displaced public housing residents who found replacement housing in the community. And so in my book, I am particularly concerned with developing a sociological account of how the arrival of public housing residents impacted community dynamics and community spaces. And what I show was a significant transformation of the social composition of the neighborhood, which is particularly articulated through new class dynamics and conflicts between middle-class long-term residents and public housing newcomers who are mostly from low-income working-class backgrounds. Basically aware of what public housing high-rises had symbolized in Chicago, from associations with gang violence, crime, to drug dealing, longtime residents in South Shore portrayed the arrival of public housing residents as a disruption to existing community networks. And in particular, they blamed public housing residents as responsible for allegedly increasing crime rates and gang activities in the community, as well as for failing to adhere to expected norms and values around maintaining of properties and building apartment buildings. So what I observed was a process of othering that characterizes everyday life in community spaces, where long-time residents identify social, cultural, and class-based difference between them and newcomers from public housing. And at the heart of these narratives was the firm belief that public housing residents grew up in an urban environment unsuitable for living in a community like South Shore because they grew up in an urban environment that was highly policed and controlled by the Chicago Police Department, Chicago housing authorities, and private security companies, which had a tough grip on everyday life in housing projects. But the failure by public housing newcomers to act in accordance with existing community norms and values contributed again to feelings of alienation with how the arrival of public housing residents took place. And as a result, differential belongingness between long-term residents and newcomers are acted out in urban space. And so these status differentiation, following Elias and Scottson here, emphasize that spatial knowledge of how to act, behave, and live in urban communities determines one's belongingness to community spaces. And this knowledge of how to live in an urban space comprises what Lefebvre refers to as a social spatial superstructure, and administered in this case by class belongingness and disparities. But these sociological observations, I think, also pose moral and ethical dilemmas for us as researchers in criminology and in sociology. And as aptly stated, I think, by the American sociologist Mary Patillo in her study of black middle class residing in Chicago, and I quote, "The stance of middle-class blacks against the opportunities of poor blacks to have decent, low-cost housing presents complicated interpretive dilemmas. How do we discern the moral high ground in this debate when both sides claim to be victims?" End of quote. And besides pointing out that there was never an increase in the crime rates in destination communities, this was just a perception among residents, I think Lefebvre's writing on the role of state planning and capitalism in the production of urban space also provides a possible way for answering or dealing with this dilemma. The arrival of public housing residents in Chicago and South Shore and in other black communities was first and foremost the outcome of a plan that at its core was guided by premises to produce what Lefebvre calls a capitalist space that served private and state interests of profit-making sensibilities. So here, residents were turned into docile bodies under a capitalist paradigm of quote-unquote neighborhood revitalization. So while framed as an attempt to deconcentrate poverty and to demolish public housing, apartment buildings, the transformation of public housing in Chicago was a political decision of capitalist urban planning to generate surplus value through land valorization and gentrification-centered redevelopment. And such urban planning, Lefebvre remarks in the writings of Cities, and I quote, formulates all the problems of society into questions of space and transposes all that comes from history and consciousness into spatial terms. It is an ideology that immediately divides up, end of quote. And this dividing up became clearly visible in how the plan to transform public housing was pursued entirely undemocratically, without any consultation from tenant leaders, community organizers, or housing activists, both in public housing communities but also in destination communities like South Shore. So the plan disregarded residents' right to the city and their right to the participation in the production of space, silencing them in their ability to determine for themselves what community spaces should look like. The transformation of Chicago's public housing already foregrounds how the city's south side has been undergoing major urban transformation and redevelopment efforts in more recent years and decades. Besides what Bacon has chronicled in his work, is history of warehousing and spatially confining the city's black poor, this part of the city has more recently also developed into a critical space for citywide efforts to elevate Chicago as the next global city for tourism and investment. And in the final period part of my book, I turn to infrastructure-led urban redevelopment that is currently today unfolding on the city's south side through an examination of the Obama Presidential Center, which you can also see here. And again, once more, drawing on the role of territorial stigmatization and the criminalization of space for making sense of this infrastructure. So framed as a transformative project for Southside communities to generate economic prosperity and growth, the Obama Center, which will open next year, comprises an $800 million, 19-acre spanning mega infrastructure project which will privatize and commodify large parts of a public park through the construction of a campus of new buildings and facilities. And here the Obama Center follows in an established tradition in the United States to commemorate and celebrate the legacies of presidents through the construction of public libraries and exhibition centers in places that are important to the respective presidents. However, the Obama Center outshined previous libraries in certain terms of its size, scope, but also symbolic significance. And so in my analysis, I want to return, as I said, to the role of territorial stigmatization and the criminalization of space to make sense of this infrastructure development. And in particular, what I show in my book is that redevelopment actors behind the Obama Center, from the Obama Foundation, city authorities to community organizations, strategically activate this stigma to legitimize the growth promises made by the Obama Center. And what I mean by strategic activation, and here following the work of Tom Slater in particular, is that these actors draw on and mobilize the South Side negative reputation as a discursive resource to argue that these communities deserve better. And redevelopment actors strategically reinvigorate the history of economic decline, violence, and crime to convince residents that the Obama Center has the capacity to turn the tide of economic, social, and cultural decline. So take the following statement by President Obama, who publicly declared in 2018 at a community forum, and I quote, "Well, here's the thing. If you go into some neighborhoods in Chicago where there are no jobs, no businesses, and nothing's going on, in some cases the rents are pretty cheap, but our kids are also getting shot on that block. So what I want to do is make sure that people have jobs, kids have opportunity, the school have a better tax, and if the rent goes up a little bit, people can pay it because they have got more money." End of quote. So Obama's reference to kids getting shot on that block was just one reference to crime and violence that I repeatedly encountered in urban redevelopment discourse in and around the Obama Center. So the stigma of Chicago's South Side is strategically activated and mobilized to proclaim that the Obama Center has the capacity to positively impact and transform communities. In the words of the Obama Foundation, and I quote, "The Obama Center serves as the catalyst for long overdue investment in and around historic Jackson Park, creating a new destination to move visitors from hope to action, breathing new life into the park and delivering amenities and economic benefits to the communities the Obamas called home, providing residents in the surrounding communities with the resources they need to lead happy, fulfilled, and stable lives." End of quote. And such growth claims are then substantiated through massive speculations about how much money and profit will be generated. I don't want to read it out, but you can see in this quote on the left, such as income and so on and so forth, to kind of legitimize these growth claims and to convince the people of the South Side and Chicago more generally of the transformative potential of the Obama Center. And here, the discourse of economic growth has, what Lefebvre says, become self-legitimizing through the common sense representation of growth as universally beneficial to all residents that serves redevelopment actors to legitimize their investment efforts. And some parts of South Shore's residents that I spoke to display a similar enthusiasm for these growth promises. And it was particularly those long-term residents and those business owners who have been in the community for decades who strongly support with their community, who also strongly identify with the community, who also fully support these growth promises. And so redevelopment actors can, again, strategically build on this sense of rootedness in framing urban redevelopment as for the people and for the community. But of course, with all major urban redevelopment efforts, conflicts over the production of space also exist with the Obama Center. Because not everyone in the community echoes these growth promises and instead emphasizes that many people in South Shore and other communities in the nearby will not be able to benefit from this newfound economic prosperity and production. And one resident that I spoke to described the Obama Center as a city within the city due to its sheer size and scale. And the fear that is shared among many residents, particularly again from working class backgrounds, is that the Obama Center is just another instance in the long history of gentrification and displacement that has dominated urban renewal in Chicago for decades. However, and this is, I think, really important, instead of embracing these concerns as legitimate, the Obama Foundation and other stakeholders in quite blatant, patronizing fashion dismisses these concerned voices, arguing that these concerned voices do not speak on behalf of their communities, and therefore do not have any standing in the political discourse. And I theorize this denial to political participation through the concept of violence of disenfranchisement, which I derive from Lefebvre's notion of political alienation. So, marked with the stamp of unbelonging, critical voices are supposedly less concerned about the community than those supporting the center, and critical voices are accused of acting out of community destructive and irrational impulses. Ultimately, the push is to silence critical voices by denying them the authority and legitimacy to speak. And this symbolic violence of disenfranchisement, I argue, particularly unfolds in the invalidation of critical voices through, for example, the publication of newspaper articles and op-eds by protagonists of the Obama Foundation, or in public speeches like the one that Obama gave himself, who declared at a public meeting that he will not speak to these concerned voices because, and I quote, they do not speak on behalf of their communities. So, but there is, of course, also a much more direct form of violence that is acted out through gentrification-led urban redevelopment. Because, after all, the loss of someone's home is a traumatic event responsible for the production of multiple harms. And the fear of displacement exercises violence over the human body, not knowing whether one's rent will increase or if one can afford the taxes or the eviction itself are embodied experiences of violence and harm under accumulation by dispossession, to follow David Harvey here. So residents' fear of gentrification speaks to the affective kernel of Lefebvre's lived space as a form of violence which slowly creeps into people's lived realities and everyday experiences. It is a form of slow violence following Rob Nixon, which does not erupt instantaneously in space, but rather its repercussions play out across different temporal scales. So the invalidation, the silencing, the marginalization of those voices critical of gentrification, as well as the prospect of displacement in the near future, already constitute instances of symbolic and structural violence way before the Obama Center has opened its doors. Okay, I would like to stop my presentation of the book here, and also how Lefebvre has helped me to make sense of the complexity of urbanization and the production of space in Chicago, to turn to the question of how Lefebvre's work can be useful for criminology in the future. And in particular, how his theory of space provides useful theoretical and conceptual ideas and frameworks for deciphering the connection between space, crime, and insecurity. And of course, I'm not the first one in criminology. I want to build on existing criminological research here on the so-called spatial turn in criminology, such as the work of Keith Hayward, Elaine Campbell, or Thea Candinas, among others. And I agree with these authors that space comprises a crucial concept in criminology to decipher the role, relevance, and perseverance of crime and justice in today's society. And in this respect, Ian, you in your work on crime and social change in Middle England make an important point about the relationship between space, place, and crime. And I want to quote you. You said that crime talk and place talk are unlikely to prove to be clearly separable, and both are likely to be some way on the experience of change that confront people both in the immediate circumstances of their daily routines and through the larger relays of media and political culture. End of quote. And I really agree with the statement, because crime and responses to crime always and inevitably work spatially and are articulations of specific social, economic, political, and cultural arrangement, processes, and structures which become evident and visible in space. So crime takes place in space. Responses to crime take into account the spatial environment where crime occurs. The lived experience of safety and insecurity are spatial articulations of people's affective associations with their urban environment. The distribution of crime across city is an articulation of state-led planning and spatial engineering, as my example of public housing has shown. And under globalization, the multiscalarity of space has allowed us to make sense of the global conditions of late modernity through space of flows, here following Castells, and how space mediates global mediascapes and cultural production, including those that reference crime. And as you said, Ian, in your conclusion of your book, and I quote again, people continue to live somewhere, go about much of their routine daily life somewhere, and persist in acquiring and developing material and emotive attachments to particular places, whether that be their home, street, neighborhood, town, or nation. Crime and order figure in some powerful, if uneven ways, in how these places are experienced, imagined, and defended. End of quote. But I think what will be important for a criminology of space is to engage in an in-depth theoretical discussion of what we mean by space, beyond stating its geographical articulations through labels like home, street, neighborhood, and so on and so forth. In other words, space denotes more than territorial locations. It is first and foremost an abstract concept, which is not immediately localizable, concrete, and contextual like the notion of place. But this is, I think, not a shortcoming at all. In fact, I would argue that its abstractedness also offers opportunities to develop a theoretical, analytical scaffolding through which crime can be studied. And I want to borrow the words of geographer Peter Merriman here, who recently argued in his acclamation of the concept of space that, and I quote, "The importance, influence, and potential political utility of the concept of space lies precisely in its power to transcend disciplinary, philosophical, and mythological boundaries." End of quote. And I think that embracing the theoretical, philosophical complexity and interdisciplinarity of the concept allows us to develop an understanding of space which can be used across areas of research within criminology. From, for example, studies on the impact of crime on urban space, crime prevention strategies, the role of crime talk in criminalization, carceral articulations of power, deciphering life after prison, and how the policing of public space impacts young people in everyday lives particularly strongly, just to name a few areas of our research in criminology. And coming back to Lefebvre, I think in his conceptualization of space, we can find a great source of theoretical inspiration for studying space across these different areas of research in criminology. And I think the reason for that is, in my opinion, his understanding of space precisely transcends those disciplinary, philosophical, and mythological boundaries that Merriman identified as crucial to the notion of space. Well, after all, Lefebvre developed his spatial theory through a close reading of key philosophers with different epistemological foundations, from Hegel, Marx to Nietzsche, where he was particularly concerned with the Marxist critique of capitalism and how capitalism changes space. But he was also a sociologist who was keenly concerned with understanding how space is experienced by people in their everyday lives. And while I have already sketched out some of Lefebvre's work on space in my talk so far, I want to go into a more detailed theoretical discussion of his spatial theory to foreground the ways in which it can make sense and help us in criminology. And obviously, the book where Lefebvre developed his theory of space is The Production of Space, which was published in 1974 and then translated into English in 1991. And what perhaps immediately stands out in this title is the word production. And indeed, for Lefebvre to speak of the production of space is crucial because space does not exist as a static container that is fixed in time, which is simply there. Space cannot exist before the things that are placed inside of it. Rather, space is a social product that is constantly produced and reproduced through social, cultural, political, and economic activities and relationships. And to theorize this production process, Lefebvre suggests a spatial theory that consists of three interrelated spatial dimensions: spatial practice, representations of space, and spatial representations, which you can see here, but I want to also talk about these in more detail now. So let's start with spatial practice. This dimension of space denotes the physical forms and aspects of space. The spatial practice produces a space that can be perceived with our senses, so from seeing, hearing, smelling, and feeling. It is therefore a space of the practical sensual world in which activities of collective actors become inscribed into material objects and realities. Representations of space here at the bottom denote the discursive element in the production of space. It refers to the dimension of language and how it shaped descriptions, definitions, and scientific theories about space, creating a mentally conceived space. It is therefore the dimension of the production of space that refers to knowledge that we have about space, including those ideological assumptions that I have described earlier. And finally, spaces of representation are the dimension of lived space, which is rooted, and I quote Lefebvre here, in the history of a people as well as in the history of each individual belonging to that people, end of quote. So included in this history are all kinds of images, memories, and symbols of a group of people. And so spaces of representation embody complex symbolisms that are sometimes coded, sometimes not, but are linked to the clandestine and underground side of social life. And as such, this lived space is not visible like the materiality of space, or we can understand it through language and discourse like representations of space, but it's rather hidden. These are the symbols that people associate with space. So let me give you an example of how Lefebvre's spatial theory can guide research in criminology, which is again, of course, from my research in Chicago. And I want to particularly focus on the social production of spaces of insecurity on Chicago's South Side. And to do this, I need to return to my example of public housing transformation and the arrival of public housing residents into South Shore. So my previous description of stigma and belongingness between long-term residents and newcomers from public housing also became visible in the spatiality of the neighborhood. So in conversations, long-time residents were able to clearly identify those spaces that they associate with more affluent residing and middle-class residing, and those streets and blocks that are associated with public housing, and for them with more insecurity. But to an outsider to the community like myself, this differentiation is not visible, and only a specific knowledge, so Lefebvre's representations of space that residents have with their neighborhood allow them to make such differentiation. So take the following example of an area in South Shore that residents only refer to in everyday life as quote-unquote Terror Town. A lifelong community residents clarified to me in a conversation which area is referred to in this framing. And I quote him, 75th to 79th Street, Colfax over to Yates Boulevard, and they base that on because so many people have gotten shot. End of quote. So here, the resident displays a very specific spatial knowledge of boundaries and territoriality that is unavailable again to a community outsider because it's not visible in the space. Another youth worker told me the history of Tarrytown and that this area was central to the institutionalization of black street gangs in Chicago, particularly the Blackstone Rangers and Gangster Disciples in the 70s and 80s. So the example of Tarrytown vividly shows how, and as quote Lefebvre here, space is only known in and through time. Historically, Tarrytown was an important space for the institutionalization of black street gangs in Chicago. And at that time, and drawing on Lefebvre's spatial theory, the lived space of Tarrytown was associated with the symbolisms and images of institutionalized street gangs who controlled large part of this area, often through violent means. And so these lived experiences in turn produce specific representations of space associated with violence, crime, and insecurity. But at the same time, these representations combined with the symbolisms also function to deter others from entering this part of the community, thereby shaping and determining spatial practice. So today, fast forward to today, Tarrytown is synonymous with public housing and has yet become a space of avoidance for those residents who associate higher levels of crime and violence with public housing residents, even though there is no such connection between these two. So the association and representation of Tarrytown as a quote-unquote public housing community serve residents as a discursive framework to view this space through a classificatory differentiation. Representations of space here are paired with lived experiences to associate this part of the community with danger, violence, and insecurity, which is best to be avoided in everyday practices and spatial practices. And it is these stories and knowledge about Tarrytown, to use your word, Ian, again from your book on youth policing and democracy, and I quote, that become integral to perceptions of public space and its attendant dangers, rendering places symbolically more dangerous than they really are in any material sense. End of quote. So the example of Tarrytown shows the relevance of space for understanding the situatedness of crime, violence, and the perception and experience of danger in public space. As you, Ian, and your colleagues state in your study on crime and social change in Middle England, public responses to crime can only be fully appreciated against, and I quote, a proper understanding of the context and settings in which they are voiced, end of quote. And I think Lefebvre's spatial theory, via his three-dimensional differentiation between perceived, conceived, and lived, provides a useful theoretical framework and anchor for deciphering the impact of crime on space and vice versa. It extends our understanding of the role of crime beyond a mere focus on its geographical location in neighborhoods or in cities towards an appreciation how crime and insecurity are experienced in people's lives, how people make sense of the presence of crime and insecurity through the construction of a discursive space and knowledge structures, and how crime ultimately, therefore, also shapes and determines people's spatial practices, routines, and behaviors. But beyond a sociological account of the relationship between crime, insecurity, and space, Lefebvre's work also allows us, in my opinion, to foreground the political dimension of space. And as I have demonstrated already in my discussion of public housing and urban redevelopment, space is political and determined by political economic interests of capitalist urbanization and redevelopment. As Lefebvre writes in his The Survival of Capitalism, and I quote, "Capitalism has succeeded in achieving growth. We cannot calculate at what price, but we do know the means, by occupying space, by producing space." End of quote. And such occupation and production of space by capitalism holds, in my view, also important implications for research in criminology, particularly on crime, insecurity, and the role of space. So take, for example, the policing of public space. Policing not only determines people's ability, particularly of young people, to appropriate public space and spending time outside of their homes. Policing as an articulation of state power is also crucial for the reproduction of the capitalist system of surplus value generation and economic development via the production of space. So, for example, the policing of homelessness, which Don Mitchell and Brett Story have so powerfully shown in their research, is a crucial aspect of today's urban political regime to banish poor people from public space to ensure that capital accumulation and that land valorization can take place. And in doing so, policing often only serves the interests of landowners, real estate speculators, and tourists as the new consumer group in the entrepreneurial and revanchist city, to use David Harvey and Neil Smith's influential city concepts. And I think Lefebvre's writing on state space provides the meta-theoretical framework for deciphering the nexus between state violence, power, and capitalism, and how this nexus operates first and foremost spatially. Because for Lefebvre, the role of the state in reproducing capitalist development becomes particularly evident in how the state alters space. And the aim of the state space is to homogenize space to make it fruitful for capital accumulation, while at the same time exercising domination over space through the segregation and exclusion of those elements that stand in the way of capital accumulation. And so for Lefebvre, according to his state theory, urban segregation becomes the specter of the urban. By determining the production of space in order to reproduce and reaffirm capitalist development, the state introduces its presence and control and surveillance in the most isolated corners. And policing is just one example of how the agents of the state influence the production of space to reaffirm and reproduce the capitalist order. Other state actors relevant to our research in criminology, such as penal authorities, housing authorities, or border forces, just to name a few, operate spatially in the reproduction of the criminalization of population and individuals on the basis of race, gender, class, sexuality, and others. And Lefebvre's Marxist theory of the production of space, in my view, can provide an important overarching framework because it simultaneously scrutinizes how the capitalist system and the state reproduce multiple inequalities, as well as how it seeks to decipher the lived experiences with these multiple inequalities in people's everyday lives. As I said at the beginning of this talk, Lefebvre was both a philosopher and a sociologist. So he was always concerned with finding ways for making his abstract conceptualizations of space and the political economy of capitalism tangible and usable for concrete sociological observations. While his own writings at time lacked concrete operationalization of his concept of empirical research, it is still possible, I think, to conclude with the words of Lefebvrean scholar Christian Schmidt, who said that we need, and I quote, to take Lefebvre's work as setting a direction for inquiry. This would be a form of appropriation that would creatively use the openness of the theoretical constructions, stimulating critical thinking through the cooperative, argumentative dialogue that Lefebvre himself held in such high esteem. End of quote. And I hope that with today's talk, I was able to show possible ways of appropriating Lefebvre's work for empirical, sociological, and criminological research on the city, but also beyond the city, of course. And perhaps I have also encouraged some of you here in the room today to perhaps engage more deeply with the depth and breadth of Lefebvre's work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Right, we have plenty of time for comments and questions and discussions. So, sorry, backstage activities. So the floor is open.
I just had a question. So the way that you frame,